the New Zealand student debt bill has now reached $15 billion. MPs have passed a law making it easier to track Kiwi student loan defaulters living in Australia. So that could bring a lot more money. But just around the panel before we go to Hayley, Peter, what do you make of this extraordinary amount of debt?
Well, I introduced the legislation that gave us the right to chase people offshore. And the problem has been that we've got some people who've agreed to pay and make repayments, but we have a big problem with long-term debtors who simply feel that they've given New Zealand the miss, they've got no more responsibility here, but the interest bill keeps ticking on their debt, which is why it's got to this
Which is entirely unfair. People try and make their life in Australia. All of a sudden, here's an example. A Kiwi living in Australia, 15 Ks in the 1990s, he now owes $80,000.
Yeah, but you can look at that from the other perspective too. When these people took out loans, they took out the responsibility of repaying those loans. The fact that they've gone to another jurisdiction doesn't absolve them of that responsibility. And more importantly, with that level of debt, it's not fair to those coming through now who are paying off their debt.
And your student loan was what?
Well, I actually took out a loan from a bank to get me through university, and I'm not sure what it would be in today's terms, but I repaid it within 3 years of graduating.
All right, Tracy Martin, what do you think about this issue?
We got $284 million owed by around about 330,000 people, 90% of them living overseas, with 80% of that 90% having had their loan from 1992. This is too long. It's too long to now decide that we're going to reach into their bank accounts through their inland revenue in Australia to actually get this debt. Should have been dealt with a lot longer than this.
But you haven't explained you haven't given us a solution though. How are you going to recoup that money?
Well, there are two things. There's two things. First of all, the dollar for dollar student repayment policy of New Zealand First. New Zealand First. If they come back and actually work in New Zealand and bring their skills here, there's dollar for dollar student repayment. That goes for everybody in that $15 billion pot. As long as they stay there, however, there are New Zealand students staying here with New Zealand incomes who are paying their debt. You have a debt, you must pay it. It's part of the honour system.
You have a debt, you must pay it. Chris, what do you think of this? 70% of overseas borrowers are in default. What does that tell you?
It's about $3 billion of people owed are in default. And look, the New Zealand taxpayer paid 75% on average of the student's education. Then they gave them a loan to help them through. And look, they've absconded to Australia, they've gone to other countries, they need to pay it back, and we've got to find them and get them to pay it.
What does that tell you perhaps about your policies? I've heard people who go into Australia because they can't afford to live in New Zealand because they can't get a good job here.
Wallace, 1 million New Zealanders live offshore. Kiwis have always travelled. The point is, if you go offshore to work in the UK or Australia or America or whatever, and you go with a student loan, your obligation to pay it back does not cease. It's fairness for the New Zealand taxpayers, and as Peter Dunn points out, fairness for current students.
That sounds fair enough.
They are taking money away from current students.
That sounds fair enough to me.
Well, first of all, I didn't have a student loan, and I really feel sorry for those who have got them. And we've got to think of some creative...
You introduced them. The Labour Party in 1989 introduced student loan scheme.
And we took the interest off them as well.
Yes, that's true.
And so I feel sorry for those who've had to pay for their tertiary education, which is why we've said we ought to give post-secondary education 3 years free, because we've got to get back to affordable post-secondary education. But Wallace, I think we've got to have a creative solution to those. Wait a minute. I think you've got to look at the penalties that are put on the loan. Now, what you want people to do is to start paying back the loan itself. And so I think we've got to look at ways that we can look at the penalties. We've done it before. We've done it for those who are liable parents. Why can't we do that?
Chris, we'll come back to you. We'll go to Hayley, and then we'll come back to you guys.
Yes, I'm here with Lindsay Higgins, the President of the National Students' Union. You don't trust the IRD to deal with this, do you?
No, we know there are instances, for example, where they accidentally arrested someone at the border at the start of the year when actually they're a New Zealand citizen. So we're really concerned that they won't get the job done right, especially given that they need $1 billion to overhaul their system, which the government isn't giving them.
But we do sort of have to do something about it, because I guess you made the deal to have this money. You should really pay it back.
Oh, we definitely agree with that. We know there's the commitment, but we think there's a commitment from the government to not change our loan agreement every budget season, and actually for them to do the job right and to incentivise payment and actually promote the payment systems that exist out there. to help students pay back their loans.
In an ideal world, in a perfect world, what would you do about our student loan debt?
I think we need to start looking at writing off some of those really historical debts. We have businesses have things called bad debt for a reason, and there are people who did 6 months of study back in 1992, and we're never going to see that money, and we should just look at writing it off.
Well, thank you very much. Back to you, Wallace.
Writing off. I just want to hands up those in the house tonight. That's interesting. Writing off that debt, because there are some big debts owing now. Hands up those who think that we should write the debt off. Hands up. About 25%, maybe 20%, 50, maybe even less. What do you think, Annette? Do you think we should round the pan? Do you think we should write off some of this debt? It's gone.
I think you've got to look at a way that you can reduce the debt for them. I think we write off tax for people who don't pay them. We do arrangements with IRD. I think you've got to look at each individual case. You'll have some people who have never had a job that's going to pay it. So you could do it on an individual case and see whether you could wipe some of it off.
Write off some of this debt.
That is actually the status quo. Yeah. So if you go to the IRD and you say, look, I took out a 6-month loan and suddenly the penalties have massively accrued, the IRD is reasonable, maybe they could be more reasonable, they'll come to an arrangement with you. But can I just make a broader point about the student loan scheme? Because Annette said she didn't have to have a student loan, she got free tertiary education. That is true. People who went to university in the 70s and 60s got free tertiary education. But the number of people who went was very small. And since the student loan scheme's been introduced, access for Maori and Pacifica and other groups has massively expanded, and that's very good.
But you are changing society, aren't you, though? People who are deferring to buy a house,
yes.
Deferring to have children because they're struggling with an average of, $14,000 to $20,000.
Actually, that's often said, but the Ministry of Education and a bunch of economists have done a lot of studies on this, and actually it's not true. So I know people don't think it's accurate, but it's actually not if you look at the evidence.
Okay, Tracy, brief word.
Oh, I just think, first of all, you shouldn't have a student loan to start with. I mean, New Zealand First has never actually stood for the fact that we needed to. Well, in New Zealand
free
First,
education.
Absolutely. I mean, free post-secondary education, and you keep your skills inside of New Zealand. You have a skill debt to your country. You stay here and you pay off that skill debt to your country through working here.
Free education?
Well, United Futures always said we would have no fees, and in return for that we'd abolish student allowances because we'd actually trade the two off. What that would mean, and it gets to the core of the problem, is that you would then have people borrowing for living costs only, so you wouldn't have the distortion created by expensive courses. It means that the debt that a student had after 3 or 6 years would be the same regardless of what course they'd undertaken. And that then would reduce the level of debt and make it easier to repay.
Hey, look, if you've got a massive student loan, get in touch. I'd be keen to hear your story at Backbenchers TV. What do you think about this issue? Next up, the living wage. Can New Zealand really afford it?